in the head center, pointed down towards the Ajna center to its harmonic gate, the 24, the return, and forming the channel of awareness, a design of the thinker. And the 61st gate is the gate of mystery, my story, if you will. A little different than history and his story. Here we have the 61st gate, inner truth, the awareness of universal underlying principles. Now the 61st gate is a pressure gate. It is a pressure gate. Its opposition in the wheel is the 60th gate, the pressure in the root center of the individual process. So the 61st gate is a mental pressure gate in the individual mutative process, and it is the pressure to have a mutative thought. It is the pressure to have an original concept. It is this pressure to know the unknown. And of course the difficulty is that if one is not operating correctly, the pressure to know the unknown becomes the potential madness of trying to know the unknowable. The 61st gate is this pressure to know. But of course this pressure is all rooted in the fact that we're dealing with a mutative process that operates in a pulse, that there is no knowing until the knowing emerges. None. What is interesting about the 61st gate is that if you look at its first line, the foundation line is called occult knowledge. And it's interesting to note that inner truth, real inner truth, is something that is hidden and has always been hidden. You can see that in the chop itself. And when I say the chop, I mean the hexagram construct, the 6 lines of the hexagram 61. And if you look at that, you'll see that it's 2 yang lines. The first and second line are yang, and then the third and fourth line are yin, and the fifth and sixth line are yang. In other words, you have these 2 yin lines sandwiched between 2 double yang lines. And basically here is your inner truth. And yet you can see that the inner truth is form. That is, the inner truth is the yin. It's not the yang that envelops it with all of its illusion and maya. You know, it is the yin that is in the deep core. And so here in the first line you have either the pressure to know the mysteries through esoterics, or where the pressure to know the mysteries can be so strong that one can eventually be incapable of handling exoteric realities. In other words, that, you know, so much of inner truth has to be found in the hidden, and yet so many beings can get so trapped in looking in these hidden places that they do not see the world for what it really is. And remember that this is a pressure. And the most fascinating thing about any of the gates of the head center is to recognize that over 70% of humanity has the head center undefined. Now, the not-self strategy of an open head center is to think about things that do not matter. You know, this is the deepest dilemma of the open head center, thinking about things, being under pressure, pressure from others, pressure from the program that activates the head center in a definition, this pressure to think about things that are not for you necessarily to think about. And there's so much of it. And if you're somebody with a 61st gate in an open head center, you know, and 70% of the people who will have a 61st gate will have that in an open head center. You know, the fact is that there is this enormous pressure, and this enormous pressure suddenly to think about something, trying to know something, when in fact there's no approach. Knowing is so different from understanding or sensing. It's so different. Sensing is based on experience. Understanding is a projection process into the future through patterns. Both of them have an ability to make up their minds partially the way through their trip. You know, you don't have to go all the way back through all of history to come up with an example that you need in order to substantiate whether you should say yes or no to something. And the same thing is true for the logical process. You don't have to go all the way to the full extent of any pattern. You know, you simply come up with a little formula and you say, okay, this is what works and this is going to work. And so you say yes or no to something. But knowing? In knowing, there is no knowing until you know. And this is perhaps the most difficult thing of the open head center with the 61. This continual pressure that comes, and pressure that is not consistent but comes and goes. And when it's there, it inflates the head center and puts this enormous pressure on it to know, when in fact, knowing is something that's either going to be there or not. The 60-second game, the preponderance of the small in the throat center pointed up towards the ajna center to its harmonic gate, the 17th gate following, forming the channel of acceptance, a design of an organizational being. And the 60-second gate is the gate of detail, and I mean the gate of detail. We actually have two gates of detail in the body graph. The 9th gate, the taming power of the small, which is the energy for detail work, the energy to focus on detail. But the 60-second gate is the expression of detail. It is a gate of caution and patience and detail which produce excellence out of limitation. And one of the things to be clear about the 60-second gate is that this is a very profoundly metamorphic gate. This, mystically speaking, is the gate that establishes the Maya, because this is the gate that gives everything its name. This is the gate of naming things. This is the gate of facts. And when you look at the nature of the 60-second gate at its basis, in other words, you take a look at the first line, it's all about routine. And this is, of course, one of the fundamental themes of the logical process. The logical process is based on repetition and habit. You know, these are very profound logical themes. To be able to be focused and concentrated, to be able to have a habit that keeps you in a specific flow, and to be able to have a routine, for example, where you practice something or work at something or study something. This is all about practice makes perfect. This is probably the deepest and most profound motto of the logical process. And so for the detail process, detail isn't something that is going to reward you because suddenly you decide to look something up. Detail is rewarding when detail is a part of your process. It's a part of your routine. And it's the ability to transcend the boredom of routine through a rich and daring fantasy life. The ability to organize the detail through fantasy and the need for expression which ignores the details. These are the two sides of dealing with routine. In other words, detail work comes from the practice of something through a pattern. Now, the practice of something through a pattern can be very boring unless one can transcend it. This is true for every musician that's ever had to practice an instrument. There is a quality of boredom if you are practicing scales. And yet at the same time, there is the ability to be able to both practice the scales and transcend the moment. The reverie that comes when one is completely within a pattern. The experience you have when driving your car, you suddenly realize that you don't remember how you got from A to B. There you are in the pattern and you're off in the fantasy. The other thing is the relationship of fantasy to the perfection of detail. And what I mean by fantasy is just the application of the imagination. In other words, the ability to be able to look at detail is often enhanced by the ability to imagine how the pattern will operate before one really begins to work with it. This is a theoretical process, an intellectual process. And yet at the same time, being able to use your imagination and draw out the detail into extended patterns is the way in which you explore it in depth. It's also the way in which you transcend the routine itself. The routine of doing a job doesn't stop you from dreaming of where it can lead you to. And the dream itself can be deeply satisfying. And in the dream of what can happen and where the potential can go is the possibility of discovering the details that are so valuable. Because the details are everything. And it has to do with the expression of detail. It has to do with being able to put the right name with the right thing. This very, very precise, patterned way of expressing oneself so that others can understand. The deepest fear in the logical mental process is that through expression of the detail, that the other does not grasp it. And so again, one of the advantages of the imagination as applied to detail is the imagination in terms of how does one express this detail. It is here, for example, that words are coined in order to make it easier for others to be able to grasp a concept. The 60-second gate is an extraordinary gate, and yet, like everything, it only operates correctly when you operate correctly.